It is really such an important topic that we have in front of us tonight, and that is healthy and productive conversation across difference, especially around our Thanksgiving tables later this week. I'm so grateful that you have all shown up this evening, and I'm so excited to introduce our speaker for this program together. Tonight, we are learning from our friends and colleagues at Facing History, Facing Ourselves. And Stacy Rosenthal is going to introduce herself, but one word about Facing History before I turn things over to Stacy. Facing History and Facing Ourselves is really an organization that is dedicated to learning from the choices of the past so that we can make good and better choices in the present. That is on a personal level as well as on a societal level. So with our partners at Facing History, we wanted to make sure that all of us feel ready to face the holidays, face family, face friends who we may not agree with over the coming week and weeks. So without further ado, on behalf of Central Synagogue, I am so delighted that you are all here, and I turn things over to Stacy Rosenthal.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be with all of you. I've been a part of some events with Central Synagogue in the past. I'm originally from New York myself, although I'm currently based in Boston, Massachusetts. And it's just such a joy to be in conversation with you, especially at such a challenging moment with the holidays coming up. I appreciate you spending the time with me tonight. A little bit about me, just to let you know how long I've been at Facing History. I've been at Facing History for about 7.5 years. I work on the Jewish education team specifically, so I am sort of the partner between our network of Jewish educators and synagogues and communities around the country and Facing History's resources and material. So I'm very happy to be in conversation with all of you, and we're just going to jump right in since we have limited time. As I said, I started in 2016 and I was hired in that summer, and Facing History looked a lot different than it began to look shortly after I was hired. I come in with a Holocaust education background specifically, and that was still a majority of what we were doing at the time, and it still is what we're doing a lot of. But as you all know, and a very important election happened in November of 2016 that really changed the landscape of American, socio-political atmosphere, and our work really pivoted into current events very quickly. And in the November season of that year, we knew that people were headed home for Thanksgiving, not unlike this year, with some tension around politics and discussions that were going to happen at the Thanksgiving table. And we published an ad that you see here on the left in the New York Times that year, a full-page ad that said, "We need to talk." And it was, the goal of that ad was to bring people together around being able to have conversation across difference, even then, knowing that it was going to be a challenging season. And that work really began to develop into what we cultivated as a resource that now lives on our website. It's called Fostering Civil Discourse. How do we talk about issues that matter? And to be honest with you, it's been the #1 thing that we have gotten requests around really for the last 2 to 3 years from schools and Jewish communities across the country. How to work that muscle of being able to engage in conversation with someone productively who doesn't have the same opinion that you have. It's a challenging time, as we know, the world that we're living in, and specifically with what's happening in Israel and Gaza at the moment. And so we're really using this resource a lot in the last 6 weeks as well to help communities navigate having conversation at this time. We're not actually going to spend time in that resource. I did put together a little resource packet that I'll make sure to link at the end of this time together. And this material is linked on that little packet that I made. But one thing I do want to just mention from the Fostering Civil Discourse Guide is that the first step to having this conversation, having a difficult conversation that we believe in, is starting with yourself. It's really true to Facing History's pedagogical approach that we believe having sort of any conversation about difficult moments in history or difficult moments today involves first examining how you feel around the topic that you're discussing, that it's really crucial actually to being able to engage in conversation with someone else is to have an understanding of your approach to that conversation. So that is where I would like us to start. I have a little journal prompt. It's you don't have to actually, have a journal in front of you, but if you do have like a piece of scrap paper and a pen, that would be helpful. And I'd like for you to just spend a minute or two thinking about the question that you see here on the screen. I feel blank when talking about the war in Israel and Gaza with loved ones. Sorry, that should say loved ones, because blank. And just take a minute and sort of fill out this sentence stem. And when you have your answer, and this is not a rush, I invite you to populate the chat box with your emotion that you feel. You could give us the reason, but I'm really asking for the emotion. I feel blank. Thank you for populating the chat box, and I'm sorry to hear about these emotions, and I totally understand them. Anxious, heartsick, in pain, frustrated, conflicted, apprehensive, empowered, hypocritical. We see a lot of a repetition of anxious. It's a very challenging time. These emotions are extremely understandable. I like to see a little mixture here. We have some folks who are indicating more maybe positive leading emotions. The majority of them are understandably difficult emotions that we're feeling at this time. And I'm feeling so many of the same emotions that you're naming in the chat box. And it's a very difficult time. I'd like to also just point out, like, many of us probably feel these emotions throughout the day in different ways. Like we don't just feel one thing about having these conversations. We feel we're humans with complex emotions. We probably feel many of them at the same time, and they change for us throughout the day. I know that that's been the case for me, and my feelings have been changing so much around the situation. I go back and forth around a lot of different emotions. So I want to make space for all of these emotions to be in the room with us. They're going to exist. They're with us as we have these really painful and difficult conversations. And I want to just invite you to read this contract. If you were a group of educators, I might ask you to form a contract with your students, but because we're talking very specifically about loved ones and having these conversations with your families, I want to acknowledge that you probably already have your own contracts with your family. Maybe you haven't necessarily written them out and agreed upon them directly, but you have a contract. You have an agreement about how you approach each other around the table in difficult conversation. And for this time together, we are going to be spending time looking at scenarios that may evoke in us very real, painful emotions. A lot of the ones that you named here in the chat box will be with us today as we're engaged in conversation with each other. So I'm proposing this contract that you see on the screen really as a way for us to agree upon how we're going to have this time together in the next, 50 minutes. I would like for you to just read what is here on the screen. And I invite you, if there's anything you want to add to the contract as we're going about our time together, this is just sort of our way to create a space where we can have this conversation together as a group of people here tonight. And I know it's sometimes it's a little bit daunting to write or add or amend anything publicly. So I also invite you to private message me, and I'll add things into the contract as well. And if there are no amendments, I invite you, I mean, we're acknowledging all of them. And I also invite you to choose one, maybe that you might be struggling with lately, as a specific intention for today. I want to elevate a couple of comments in the chat box. We have assume goodwill. I think that's true. I think the fact that we're all here tonight to have this conversation with each other, we all want to bring our best selves to these conversations. And I see an adding limited interruption, right? We're going to try to hear each other as we're engaged in conversation with each other, definitely. I love all of these amendments. And there was a private message to me that is asking that what we say here stays here, but what we learn here goes with us. And I love that. I take that with me when I'm in group conversation as well. We're not pointing fingers at anyone who might say something. We're not bringing out specific private conversations or reflections about someone, but we're taking the learning with us and bringing that into our Thanksgiving dinner. So I appreciate that comment very much. And I like the don't walk away angry. We will have time to be together as a group in debrief. And I hope, Facing History calls that safely in, safely out. And I hope that we're both entering this conversation in contract with each other as a way to form a sort of safety around this conversation. And we'll do the same on our way out, safely out as well. And I invite you to read through the comments that your colleagues and friends are putting in the chat box. They're really excellent additions to our contract. We're going to hold all of them together. So what we're mainly here to work on are tools that we can engage in conversation with around difficult topics, specifically with Israel and what's happening in Israel. And I'm bringing in something called the straight A's for effective facilitation. I will give you a handout in a moment that has them listed on a sheet, so you'll have them in front of you with scenarios. But first, I'm going to walk you through it. These are tools that we've actually contracted with an educational consultant named Diane Goodman. Who developed them for engaging in effective facilitation of conversation and just being in a difficult conversation with each other. These are 5 A's that are meant to be sort of in our back pockets and used when something is said that's challenging and we want to be able to engage in conversation with that person. I want to be clear that there's not necessarily a rhyme or reason to the order. Some of them are meant to come after others, but some of them could be used at any moment. And I also want to be clear as I'm walking you through them that they're not all meant to be used together. It's not like someone says something difficult and you start pulling out all of the A's at once. They're meant to be 5 sort of separate tools that work together to be able to provide productivity in a difficult conversation. The first one, she says, is affirmation. Affirm and appreciate people's comments and questions, if possible. And again, it might not always be possible. If someone says something that is difficult and offensive, you're not necessarily going to affirm what that person says. However, I've been in meetings recently where affirmations has become an intention around what we're doing as a staff. And they really do go a long way. You're acknowledging to someone that you hear what they're saying and you're thanking them for their opinion or their contribution. And you can see some examples. Thank you for asking that question, or that's a really important point to consider. I know this isn't easy to think or talk about. It's an acknowledgement that you're in this difficult space with someone, and especially with a loved one. It's a way to not isolate yourself from that person from the very beginning of the conversation. So that's affirmation and appreciation. And that's what Diane Goodman says is a good way to start. Next is acknowledge what people are saying. I'm hearing that you say this, is that correct? Or so from your perspective, is that correct? Not only is this important, it's a way for you to clarify that what you're hearing is accurate, but you're also asking the person that you're in conversation with to repeat what they're saying. And in that repetition, they might hear themselves differently and offer a different way to engage in the opinion or rhetoric that they're pointing out. So you're not only doing this for your own clarification, but you're doing this for the clarification of your loved one. Then there's asking questions. What experience led you to that belief? Or how are you feeling when? Or what would it mean for you if this is true? Again, it's a way to sort of humanize the person that you're in conversation with, to really get a sense for why they feel what they feel. And it goes back to how we started in the beginning. I didn't ask you for your because end of the sentence, but we all have reasons why we feel the way we feel in conversation with each other. And so this is an opportunity for you to get a sense for what your loved one is feeling and why they're feeling it around this opinion. It's difficult and it's not always easy to understand what they're saying, but at least you're offering a way for you to hear why they feel what they feel. And then you add more information. And this is where Diane Goodman would say, we don't start with adding information, but we do have the addition of information in our back pocket so that when you are engaged in a conversation with someone and they say something that's difficult or controversial, and you know factually it is incorrect, now is your opportunity to add information that might move the conversation along. You might say something like, well, actually, this research or this article I read, it says this, or the explanation for why this happened, specifically historical context here, is really key. This is where you might bring in some of that information. Again, not starting with it, which is a form of really isolation in these moments, but having it at the ready after you've employed some of the other A's. And then lastly, assessing what's in the room and deciding how to address it. Are people starting to argue around the table? Is it, are you losing each other in conversation? I've been in discussions with my own friends in the last 6 weeks where I've had to take spaces from the conversation because we weren't moving each other forward in any productive way. That's actually a skill, to be able to assess when the conversation is productive and informative and helpful, and when it's becoming unhelpful for you to be having the conversation. I have this question in the chat box, and we speak to the pacing or moving from one of these strategies to the other. And I think it's a very case-by-case basis. So yes, I can speak to that, but I'm actually going to ask us to engage in some scenarios first around the straight A's, and then we'll come back to that conversation, because I do think it's a very case-by-case basis, not only of who's in the conversation, but what the specific it is that you're discussing. And like I said, there are times when affirmation, for example, is not productive. There are times when you might need to assess early on in the conversation because it's becoming heated from the very beginning. I want to be fully clear here. These might seem sort of like we kind of know this already. But I've been in conversation with people really recently around Israel specifically, where the straight A's, it's like a muscle that you have to keep practicing for them to be effective. The conversations, as we know, is from the emotions that you listed in the beginning of this time together, are really fraught right now and really difficult. And they do become heated pretty quickly in at least some of the conversations that I've been in. And so it takes a lot of practice to be able to employ these A's. And so, like I said, assessment, for example, might be something that you bring in relatively early because the conversation becomes heated relatively early. There isn't necessarily a clear formula for how much time to spend on each of these A's, which is why I really think it takes practice. And I'm glad that we're here together today because we are going to practice using these A's around specific scenarios related to Israel that could potentially come up at Thanksgiving. So that's where we're headed now. I'm going to put in the chat box and I'll just walk you through what I'm seeing here, what you should see on my screen. You're going to have this document in a minute. It has all of the A's listed for you. And then we crafted 5 scenarios around Israel that are very difficult conversations to engage in. Ones, I should say, that come directly from experience. Either many of us, like I teach at a synagogue here in Brookline. Some of these come from conversations I've had with my own students. And some of these come from conversations that we're hearing directly from educators and other people who are working with students right now around Israel and Gaza. And I'm going to give you the scenarios. There are also questions for you to consider at the bottom. And what I'm going to ask you to do, we're going to put you into breakout groups for at least 20 minutes, and then we'll assess from there because I want us to be able to have time to unpack them together on the other end. But I'm going to ask you to choose one scenario as a group and start incorporating the straight A's and discuss these questions along with that scenario. Oops. And then what I'm going to ask you to do once you're ready to move on, you should be spending, anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes on one scenario. And then when you're ready, you can either move on to another scenario or you can offer your own scenario, your own sort of difficult conversation or moment of tension that you've been experiencing in the last 6 weeks, and to try to practice answering these questions and using the straight A's with that scenario specifically.
Thank you so much for participating, for sharing, for being so honest and open with one another in this space. I hope that our ground rules were helpful in the conversations and help foster dialogue. So Stacy, where are we at?
Yes, we have 10 minutes to talk, and I'd really like to hear from you how this went, actually. And then I'm going to walk you through a resource I'm about to give to you to close. And here are some questions I'm putting in the chat box. Before I open it up for conversation, there's something I want to say that it was a recurring theme in the breakout rooms that I was in. And I want to elevate Karen. I think that this was your point in the breakout group that I was in. These conversations and the tools that I gave you are not meant necessarily to change the mind of the person that you're in conversation with. That's not necessarily going to happen. I think we all have that experience of being in a conversation with someone who has a different opinion around Israel right now and really wanting them to get what you're saying and agree with you. And I've had my own personal conversations, professional conversations with people who just don't agree. And we're not going to change each other's minds. What these tools are meant to do are offer strategies for you to be in conversation with someone, to wrestle with the difficult feelings that come up for you when you're in conversation with someone who won't agree with you around this. They're meant to aid in the conversation, not to get you to agree upon what you're saying. I would just want to make that clear because I've experienced that as very difficult right now. And I think that is an underlying difficulty of having these conversations. With that said, I hope these tools were helpful. Like I said, they really involve practicing. So I hope that you leave this conversation and maybe continue to practice before your dinners on Thursday. But I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, where you're left with after having some time to practice these scenarios a bit. And again, I put some questions in the chat box, but I'll repeat them. Were there any specific moments of tension or disagreement that arose for you? And how did you use the straight A's, or how could you imagine using them with your family? Or just in general, in these difficult moments?
So I think the main thing is that it will help to keep the temperature down, which is what you want, so that things don't get out of hand, hopefully, and you can have respectful discussions. And if it does get out of hand, maybe it's just, hey, let's just not talk about this anymore.
Right, that's where the assessment might come in.
Yeah.
No, that's an excellent point.
But I think the question of agreeing, getting them to agree with you, or understanding where you're coming from and educating them, that can't be accomplished in one conversation. I think it's something that's going to take a number of conversations with whoever it is in the family or friend or whoever it might be, to try and unpack the thing and have some meaningful discussions on the issue itself. And that can't be done in one conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Freeman. I see Barbara and Evan. I don't know which one of you is hoping to speak, but it's good to see both of you.
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, Jill. I think we found that we were kind of getting down to the last two A's, but we had to sort of loop back up to the first two or three to affirm again in order to keep the conversation going and acknowledge somebody else, because just as was just said, changing their point of view may or may not be the objective. I think the objective is a conversation, and it will take several times, it seems to me. I don't think you can accomplish all of that at once, and you want to listen for something you might have missed in their perspective too, and acknowledge that.
Exactly. That's where the "is that correct" piece kind of comes in. You don't necessarily have to say that aloud either, but this is a chance for you to sort of clarify if you heard them correctly, and for them to clarify that what they're saying is what they intend to be saying to you. I really love that point of the acknowledge piece. And thank you so much for bringing us, because I think that this kind of speaks to that pacing of the A's question that we got in the beginning before we went in to the breakout room. And this is why I was saying there isn't a clear formula. And I love, Barbara, that you're pointing out that you sometimes you go back to affirm, and then you go to acknowledge, and then you go back to affirm, and then you go to assess, and then you go back to affirm, right? It's not a clear linear path of making your way through these A's. They're sort of meant to be helpful as you're making your way through conversations that, like, it's easy for us almost to sit around here and talk about the difficult conversation, but when you're in the difficult conversation, it's really hard to navigate those moments. And I think that this is where the pathway isn't linear, and it's really helpful to think about them as sort of useful at any given moment in these conversations.
And I think you can share the rubric with the person you're talking to. So it's you're not doing this surreptitiously. You both realize you're heading into something, and that those become some of your ground rules or shared tools.
Absolutely. I mean, that's partly why we contracted too. Like, this could be a form of contracting between you and the person that you're engaged in conversation with. Absolutely. There are wonderful comments going on in the chat box, so I encourage you to read them. I'm wondering if there's maybe one more person who wants to share what your thoughts are before we close.
I would just say that I said this in the room, but this rubric to me can be used really for any difficult conversation. We're talking about Israel, but these are ground rules for talking to people about emotionally charged situations that come up every day.
Absolutely.
Every minute of every day, right? I mean,
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm often in the education world in my job, but we have teachers who go through something like this and then they print out and laminate the straight A's and keep them in their classroom on the wall so that when students are engaged in difficult topics around all sorts of material, they have them there and ready to use. And I think that speaks to Barbara's point of like, print them out and bring them to your Thanksgiving dinner table if that would be helpful. I think that that's like a wonderful way to acknowledge that these conversations are difficult and that you want to keep the love between you as you're engaging in something that's really challenging.
Can I speak?
Yeah, please.
What we were talking about, how nobody or nothing is binary, and finding the common agreement, the common spaces is really, really important. I mean, there are times I can't do that in real life and have had to not deal with people. I'm not talking about Israel right now, but finding that space where you can agree on something, I think is really important to humanize the other person instead of it just being a topic to be about this person.
Very much. I think that's what the straight A's are really working towards also. Like I keep going back to them, but I think that that is the point of them, is to like remember that you're, especially in this group and the forum that we're in tonight, the way that we're discussing this, like you're in a conversation with someone you love and care about very much. And that's really important. Like you might not agree with what they're saying, but you want to think of them as human and as someone that you care about, and to remember that they are also forming these opinions based on their own lived experiences and reasons. And your job is to listen and to hear, not to agree necessarily, but to listen and to hear. And I think that is the humanizing. It's Hannah Arendt, I think, who discussed, the political philosopher, who said it's in conversation with one another that we begin to humanize each other. And I think that really is accurate. You have to have these conversations in order to have like to really share in the true humanity between us.
Yeah, and if I could just add
Stacey?
one last thing is that you know, when I think about Thanksgiving and this is one piece of a person, this subject, and you know, what I try to do when I'm talking to people who I know polar opposite is to also remember all the things I'm grateful about them, so that I don't lose sight of the fact that this is just one part, and it's a conversation. This is subject's not going away after Thanksgiving, and so let's keep the glue that keeps our families together so that we can explore together.
But I want to assure folks, I've been getting a lot of direct messages and emails about the resources that have been shared tonight. We are going to try to get those to everybody before Thanksgiving. With vacation schedules, I'm actually on vacation right now. With vacation schedules, we may not be able to get the resources to you before Thanksgiving, but we will do it as quickly as we can. But the resources of the page that Stacey already shared with us, and one more that she has yet to share before we close, we will get all of that to you along with the recording of the opening and the conclusion of this session. So I'm going to let Stacey conclude for us, but let me just say thank you to all of you for being here, for participating, for being so open-hearted and so dedicated to these conversations within your own circles of loved ones.
Well, I put in the chat box a document where you'll see a lot of links that live on our webpage around fostering civil discourse. And if you scroll down, you'll see the straight A's are linked there under additional resources as well. I added a 1948 daily podcast. Someone had mentioned something around history and bringing in the importance of the history on this time. And if you haven't listened to that episode from November 3rd, I really strongly encourage it. And I put it in the chat box. I'm also putting in the chat box my direct email address to Facing History and Ourselves. If you want to continue this conversation, I'd be more than happy to be in touch with you. So please feel free to reach out to me. But thank you very much for engaging in this conversation.